programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We are pleased to welcome Ambassador Chan Heng Chee back to the Council this evening as our third Marshall M. Bouton Asia Fellow. And I also want to extend a warm welcome back to our President Emeritus, Marshall Bouton. Also, thank you to the members of our board who are in attendance tonight, whose generous support of the Marshall M. Bouton Asia Fellowship made Ambassador Chan's visit to Chicago possible. Before we begin, please know that we are on the record and live streaming this event, and please silence your phones. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels from which to choose. And if you have any questions about membership, please visit one of our young professional ambassadors in the back of the room after the program. Returning to today's program, Ambassador Chan's remarks will be followed by audience questions. We'll take audience questions from in the room and from our online audience at chi.cnf.io. Marshall Bouton will be introducing Ambassador Chan today. Dr. Bouton is President Emeritus of the Council, having served as President from 2001 to 2013. He also serves as Acting Director and Visiting Scholar at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Bouton completed his undergraduate work at Harvard College, received a master's from the University of Pennsylvania, and completed his PhD at the University of Chicago. And I will return to moderate audience question and answer session, but for now, please join me in welcoming Marshall Bouton.
Good evening, everybody. As always, I'm delighted to be back in Chicago, and especially delighted to be back at the Chicago Council. I spent 12 wonderful years here, as many of you know. I want to thank the Council and Ivo Dalder, its president, for once again organizing the visit of a Bouton Distinguished Asia Fellow to the Council. And like, as Matt said, I remain grateful to those board members and others who contributed so generously to make this fellowship possible. And I'm also grateful to Matt Abbott, who just spoke with you, for his wonderful work in organizing this visit. So as many of you know, I think the purpose of this fellowship is to help connect Chicago and Chicagoans to Asia and Asians. This is something that seems especially timely at this moment. We are especially interested as well in fellows who have a long career in understanding and working on U.S.-Asia relations. In these turbulent times, it's ever clearer to all of us that Asia will be the defining region of the 21st century. And we could not help but have a better person to help us understand that future and Asia's role in it than Ambassador Chan Heng Chee. I've been privileged to work with and know Chan Heng Chee for 30 years, both as a colleague and as a friend. And I'm really especially grateful to her for taking a full week out of her very valuable time to be here in Chicago, especially when she has so many other commitments, including as global co-chair of the Asia Society in New York, where I served for 20 years. Chan Heng Chee's distinguished career as scholar, diplomat, and civic leader has given her insights into Asia's economic and political development, into relations within the Asian region and between the United States and Asia that few other diplomats or scholars have had. She is a person who has gotten used to doing firsts. She was the first woman to have a first-class honors degree in political science from National University of Singapore, the first woman to chair her department at the National University of Singapore, the first woman to serve as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and the first woman to serve as Singapore's ambassador to the United States. She served in Washington for 16 very eventful years, from 1996 to 2012. You may all remember that that was a time of the Asian financial crisis, of course, with the 9/11 crisis and its repercussions in Asia. And so throughout that period, we all continued to watch the rise of China, an important development for Singapore as well as the rest of Asia and the United States. So saying that Ambassador Chan Heng Chee is one of Singapore's finest diplomats of her generation is truly saying something, because Singapore's diplomats are known around the world to be among the finest in the world. What has made her so successful are the same qualities that we tend to associate, rightly in my view, with Singapore itself. These I sometimes describe as the 5 Ps: professionalism, pragmatism, prudence, persistence, and patience. And if any of you has had the pleasure of dealing with a Singaporean diplomat, or for that matter, anybody from Singapore, I'm sure you will recognize what I describe. In Chan Heng Chee's case, these qualities are combined with high intelligence, unfailing energy, and a commitment to real-world action. Since she returned to Singapore in 2012, Chan Heng Chee has applied these same skills and talents to many other Singapore leadership roles in education, in global cities, and in the arts and culture. Finally, Ambassador Chan Heng Chee represents a nation that has been a model, seen around the world as a model for economic development and social stability, and a force for peace and security in Asia, now for over 70 years, always punching above its weight in world affairs of every kind. For these reasons, Singapore has often been able to speak honestly, I would say even speak truth, to Americans about how the United States can succeed and lead in Asia. There has been no moment in my career when Americans, in my view, Americans needed more to hear from Singapore than we do now. And thus, I am pleased to invite all of you to join with me in welcoming Ambassador Chan Heng Chee.
Good evening. I'm really happy to be back in Chicago. When I was ambassador in Washington, I visited many times. I love the city, it's beautiful. I love the architecture of Chicago, and the weather, I can give that a pass. Thank you very much for having me this evening as the Marshall Bouton Asia Fellow speaker. And I would really like to share with you my thoughts on the changing world order, new alignments, and new paradigms. Now, we are living in a time of dizzying and volatile swings of policies and directions on the world stage. Never in recent years have alignments changed so much and new alignments emerge with such speed. And there is a rapid restructuring of the international economic order unfolding before us. 3 developments are responsible for this. Firstly, the election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States. Secondly, the continued rise of China and the election of Xi Jinping as the President of the People's Republic of China. And thirdly, the emergence of the black swan, Kim Jong-un, who has proven to be a game changer in Northeast Asia. Now, three questions are high on the minds of Asians, and they are, firstly, how will the world accept the rise of China as a great power? Secondly, what will happen to the rapidly deteriorating US-China relationship? And thirdly, what is happening to the world order? Now, I come from Southeast Asia. This evening, I thought I would give you a perspective from the region on these questions and share some views on the emerging New World Order. I don't come from a place of crazy rich Asians. We are Asians, but we're not crazy rich. Now, let me lay out the context first. The United States has been the predominant global power for the last 70 years. It has been setting the rules and norms of the international order with its Western European allies and policed the commons. In the Asia-Pacific, America's security and economic presence allowed the countries in the region to develop their political institutions and economies. Since the end of the Cold War, in spite of perennial doubts about the U.S. continued presence, the United States has kept its alliances and maintained a robust military presence in Asia. American presidents, from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush to Barack Obama, understood the importance of Asia, though the view from Southeast Asia was that no matter which administration, America's Asia policy was really Northeast Asia policy. This reality notwithstanding, President Clinton started the US-Singapore FTA, which was fully negotiated and signed under President Bush, opening the way for other US bilateral trade agreements in Asia, Australia, and with South Korea, CORUS, and the start of the strategic TPP. After 9/11, the ensuing struggle with terrorism focused President Bush's administration on ASEAN, as the region is home to 250 million Muslims. President Obama, the first public president, is remembered for his pivot to Asia. And for Southeast Asians, I would say he really put Southeast Asia on the map. Hillary Clinton, the second Secretary of State, chose Southeast Asia, Asia as the first country to visit on her first trip after Dean Rusk and visited Indonesia. But China, the Korean Peninsula, and Japan, for different reasons, absorbed the attention of White House officials and policymakers. Now, we have watched the rise of China as an economic power since the 1990s, and its emergence as an aspiring great power during the first decade of the 21st century. The initial years were welcomed by all in the region. We knew China's size, capacity, and capability would be a formidable challenge. And in Southeast Asia, countries were trying to forge a stronger ASEAN so that we could stand up to the competition from China. On its part, China, following Deng Xiaoping's famous advice on diplomacy, Tao Kang Guang Yang Hui, keep a low profile, as Chinese official translations prefer, to hide your light, bide your time, which they say is Western and shows deception. China developed good relationships with the regional countries and did not put a wrong foot in any direction. However, with the United States distracted by wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and certainly with the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, China was left unchallenged to be more assertive in the South China Sea. The region would date China's more muscular moves from 2010 at the ASEAN Regional Forum. And in the East China Sea, China and Japan were caught in a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, that's Japanese, which China calls Diaoyutai. Now, let me talk about the election and the impact of Donald Trump. Candidate Donald J. Trump in the 2016 presidential campaign promised to take a tough take tough actions against China. Trump has long railed against the bilateral trade deficits with China, which were widening year after year. He called China a, I quote, currency manipulator, unquote, promised high tariffs and taxes to, quote, stop China cheating, unquote. He threatened to pull the United States out of TPP, questioned the value of NATO, and wanted to make Japan and South Korea pay more for the American military presence. Once elected, he did pull out of TPP and announced the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. President Trump has attacked multilateralism, did not pull out of NATO, but left his allies unmoored and uncertain. He criticized the United Nations and threatened to withdraw from WTO, claiming it does not treat the United States fairly. Now, NSC advisor John Bolton's attack on the ICC was hardly surprising, as most US presidents, from Clinton to Bush 43, had their issues with this international body. The United States has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. Mr. Trump's allies and partners interpreted his pronouncement, America First, to mean the United States would be more internally focused and more selective in its external interventions. And his UN speech in September recently reaffirmed his adherence to pursue self-interest and unilateral action with the words, "We reject the ideology of globalism and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism," and argued for the need to defend sovereignty against global governance and migration. Now, Robert Zoellick, the USTR under President Bush and former World Bank president, said in a Wall Street Journal op-ed, President Trump has rejected 70 years of US foreign policy, and other American and European commentators see him dismantling the liberal world order. Now, that's the United States. I'll talk of the rise and impact of China and Xi Jinping, because they affect the international context. China's continued rise as an economic power and its steady acquisition of military power and political influence, and the election of President Xi Jinping, the strongest leader in China since Mao Zedong, is closely watched, not only in Asia, but globally. In 2013, President Xi outlined the ambitious and breathtaking Belt and Road Initiative and created the AIIB, the bank, in 2015, with 57 founding members to give support to BRI. A former minister of a major country in ASEAN said China was playing an important role to help build infrastructure in the region. World Bank and IMF conditions were so tough, it was impossible for developing countries to borrow for their needs. More recently, however, there has been a pushback from countries who have signed onto BRI projects because they find the arrangements and debts too one-sided and not financially sustainable. The Sri Lankan government, unable to service their debt on Hambantota, has allowed China to take over the port. And Malaysia's cancellation of the high-speed rail and ports to be built by China is another example. And Myanmar has a deep water port on its west coast, I think it's pronounced Kiak Piu, I hope I get it right, has also asked for a reduction of costs. But President Imran Khan has pledged to implement the controversial $50 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor with China, which links the Xinjiang Autonomous Region through rail, road, and energy projects to the Gwadar port in the Arabian Sea. Now, the South China Morning Post, I think it's owned by Alibaba now, sees this as the start of disputes between the parties to the BRI projects, all these moves, as it takes roughly 5 years for the problems to show. Following the number of criticisms and the changing strategic environment, apparently President Xi has ordered his officials to give him a frank assessment of the risks and difficulties involved. And there are reports that domestically, the Chinese population have asked if the BRI really benefits them. And I would say, actually, China does learn. They learn from the reactions. So I think they are taking note. Now, in the South China Sea remains an issue for ASEAN. But recently, the atmospherics have improved, with the Code of Conduct framework under discussion, though Chinese actions in the South China Sea have not stopped, pushing fishermen back and so on, leaving other claimants uncomfortable. President Xi's 19th Party Congress robust speech stirred a great deal of alarm in the West. In the region, countries are trying to read what this means for Chinese foreign policy. Notably, President Xi offered a, I quote, new, unquote, option for developing countries, which is a Chinese approach to development problems, socialism with Chinese characteristics, widely interpreted as offering an alternative model. And China offered to take the lead in international cooperation in climate change. Xi also spoke of China moving more center stage, quote unquote, in this era, and making more contributions to the world. Xi described a timetable for China to achieve a moderately prosperous socialist society by 2020. That's one. To achieve socialist modernization and be a global leader in innovation by 2035, and be a great modern socialist country, a global leader in terms of composite strength and international influence by 2050. Now, in themselves, these statements could be taken as legitimate aspirations for any country. But the combination of the systematic blueprint for China and the removal of term limits for the president and vice president, and taken with the launch of AIIB and BRI and the activities in the South China Sea, raised intense speculation and hardened the postures in some quarters in the United States and in Europe to a lesser extent. Made in China 2025, the strategic plan issued, in fact, in 2015 by Premier Li Keqiang to increase Chinese domestic content of core materials to 70% by 2025 is viewed as a direct competition to the United States in the industry, especially in high-tech products. And I think this is what has really upset the United States. But the bulk of the speech, in fact, 90% of the speech, was on the unbalanced and inadequate domestic development in China, the principal contradiction. Certainly, it focused on the party and addressing issues of party reform and strengthening, issues of corruption, socialist values and culture, innovation, sustainable development, and developing the ecological civilization. Most of the speech was on this. So that is China today, stirring up the United States and causing some concern in the region. The leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, is the third factor affecting developments. He is a black swan, or is it a gray swan? Gray because it was anticipated that he would continue his missile and nuclear tests and continue to threaten the neighborhood and the United States. Black because the boldness, rapidity, and intensity with which he showed test after test to try to reach the capability with ICBM to target the US soil was a shock to all. My God, he's so ambitious, we thought. Already, he is a game changer. He fulfilled his objective of meeting President Trump in a summit and is on the way to possibly affecting a paradigm shift on the Korean Peninsula. Now, that remains to be seen. There are lots of skeptics about how he will actually denuclearize. The politics of the region and the world has certainly been shaped by these three actors. Now, there's been a lot of realignments in my region, perhaps not noticed in the United States. A slew of diplomatic meetings, summits, and collaborative endeavors have taken place in the Asia-Pacific. What do we make of the new alignments and new groupings? They all point to the uncertainty over President Trump's foreign policy and concern with a disengaged America. Some of the middle powers have begun to forge their own coalitions to counter the rise of China. Japan has become an active player in the region. It led the negotiations for TPP-11 after the US withdrawal, formed new partnerships with ASEAN countries on maritime cooperation and defense, and proposed the idea of the Indo-Pacific. Japan persuaded President Trump to adopt the concept, and under US championship, it became the free and open Indo-Pacific, started with Abe. India and Australia swiftly supported the idea. It is in reality the old Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, an informal strategic dialogue initiated by Prime Minister Abe in 2007 and bringing the same four countries together. This Quad has been identified with the large-scale military exercise, the Malabar exercise. The security grouping now wants to add economics to its objectives. This year, the United States renamed the Pacific Command the Indo-Pacific Command. That's its name now. Some groupings are beginning to be forged without the United States. Countries are beginning to think the United States is not an inevitable player or necessary player in international initiatives. And increasingly, the United States does not want to be an indispensable power or an indispensable nation. Alignments were pushed to carry on a policy without the United States, since the rationale for the policy still remains strong. The continuation of TPP as TPP-11 was driven by this logic. And we held it out open. When the United States is ready to come in, you can come in. But if you push the terms up, I think it's going to be quite difficult, Similarly, the nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1 and the EU was upheld by the other parties, despite the US exit. Now, I call Kim Jong-un a game changer. He caused a flurry of summits and diplomacy that would otherwise not have happened, and in one swoop, marginalized Japan on the Korean Peninsula. He had China worried for a while and looked like moving to establish a relationship with the US and South Korea. But North and South Korea have moved in their relationship, and Kim has met Trump, a meeting previously thought impossible. And talks between the North and South Korea continues. It'll be quite interesting if they do actually arrive at some détente, some adjustment. This year, we have seen India and China meeting at the summit level between China and Japan, and a trilateral summit on May 9th between South Korea, China, and Japan. Oh, so many moves, so much diplomacy in the region, reacting to trying to understand what's happening in America. To this, we must add South Korea's new Southern policy is moving to engage ASEAN, and India's Act East policy. Now, President Trump's willingness to raise tariffs against his trading partners earlier pushed the European Union, Japan, and China to come together in July 2018 to work out a response. Now that the United States has eased on its European allies, Europe and Japan are working together with the United States to confront China to make concessions. The major issue with China, the issues are market access, and IP rights and forced transfer of IP rights. But this coalition or cooperation advances carefully, because even as the European Union is trying to work with the US on China, at the same time it seeks to roll back US unilateral tariffs against the European bloc. So, they're working, but they have to get rid of their problems. China's Belt and Road has met with attempts to create rival infrastructure initiatives. Japan, Australia, and the United States proposed a counter-initiative, but funding is the issue. And Secretary Pompeo came to ASEAN pledging 113 million investments. But coming at the time of the announcement of a trade war with China, the offer, though welcome, left little impact on regional countries. And in September this year, I noticed OPEC approved nearly $900 million in financing and political risk insurance for 7 projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, touching on energy, healthcare, housing, financial service. Obviously, a U.S. countermove to BRI. That's how I see it, is stepping up on some of these measures. And a couple of days ago, I read that the United States may go back to establish a kind of USIA. You're spending money on culture, on soft power. It's something which I thought the United States should never have scrapped, the USIA, but it's in the Wall Street Journal. The EU, too, has come up with their own version of Belt and Road, which goes by an innocuous name, New Connectivity Strategy. It is deliberately low-key, but offers a counter to China's BRI. As BRI projects are also located in Europe, the European Union senses a challenge to their ways of doing business and sees the strategic implications of China acquiring ports in Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and Greece. And the EU is proposing to offer financing and technical expertise on infrastructure building from China overland to Europe. But the plan will only kick in 2021, assuming that the same players are there and that this political commitment remains. So they have an initiative, but it will take time. So let us see what happens. And the rest of the world is now reacting to China's strategic vision and its implications, and are now pushing back. Now I come to the US-China relationship. For Asia, the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century is the US-China relationship. Asia got used to the US-China relationship established after Nixon's visit to China, which produced the Shanghai Communique, a stabilizing element in East Asia. There were periods of tension and differences, but these were managed within a band of tolerance. President Trump changed that. In 2018, we have seen the bilateral economic relationship torn apart. Many countries in ASEAN are part of the global supply chain of manufacturing going to the US via China. So I think we are deeply concerned. President Trump has now levied 2 tranches of tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese exports to the United States. China has retaliated, raising tariffs on $60 billion of exports to China, US exports to China, at 10 to 20%. And US exports to China are far less, $130 billion in 2017, not a lot for the Chinese to tax. Now, FIRMA, which is the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, passed this year, toughens things. There was CFIUS, now there's FIRMA as well. And this has been crafted to prevent China making strategic purchases and investments, but leaves behind collateral damage through delays to facilitating investment for others. All of us get caught in this, but it's targeted against China. Danny Roderick from Harvard Kennedy School, from the Harvard Kennedy School, in a meeting in Singapore, warned that the United States-China relationship is at an inflection point, entering into uncharted territory. I've heard the word tipping point used as well. And recently, the trade war has spread into a broader economic war, technology war, and I think influence war. The modest defense cooperation between the two powers has stopped. Some analysts see signs of an emerging new Cold War. In Asia, we hope not, and we don't even want to use this term. I notice it's used much more in the United States, but we try not to use this term. A Cold War, I think, is not likely. Certainly not a repeat of the dark days when the US and the Western world conducted their ideological war against the Soviet Union and their communist allies. There are too many overlapping interests. In any case, the economic and trade ties between China and nearly every country in Asia, including Australia and Japan, are thick and cannot be cut off without severe economic pain. China is the #1 trading partner of many countries in Asia, Japan, Australia, ASEAN certainly, and so on. On climate change, the EU and China share more in common than the European Union and the Trump administration. But we can expect, in fact, a long period of heightened tensions between the United States and China. Some have argued that the growing conflict between the United States and China is not necessarily bad for Asia. This is by the Indian strategic thinker Raja Mohan, who was the first Marshall Bouton Fellow. And he's now in Singapore leading the Institute of South Asian Studies. He points to the renewed great power competition between the United States and China means there would be more choices for the countries in the region and the prospect for a bipolar and multipolar Asia. He cites the new smile policy, diplomacy China shows to Tokyo and Delhi. China has become nicer to everybody. And the United States has also stepped up assistance. So why not? You get from both sides. With competition to the Belt and Road from the US and EU, China appears to be giving improved terms to Pakistan's Imran Khan. And with the competing initiatives out there, the countries in the region will find bargain room. Now, it is likely one outcome of the trade war is that this will accelerate the breakup of the supply chains in China, which frankly was already happening because China was getting expensive. So some of the chains were moving out and be relocated in Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and other countries in Asia. So some of that will happen. But perhaps the biggest impact of President Trump to date on the global stage is his determination to completely rebalance the major trading relationships, because this leads to the remaking of the international economic order. Renouncing multilateralism, President Trump has opted for what the Financial Times calls aggressive bilateralism as a strategy. Determined that the United States got a raw deal or signed on to the, quote, worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, unquote, President Trump has pressured trade partners to renegotiate their trade agreements. And you know what happened. NAFTA has now become USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, agreement, with some new terms for all but one the United States can live with. And South Korea has acceded to revising the terms of KORUS. Japan is entering into bilateral trade talks with the United States, and so is the EU. And at the moment, China has rejected negotiating under pressure. A major aspect of the new trade deals is the breaking of the global supply chains and redirecting much of the manufacturing back to the United States. There will be jobs created, but with the high labor costs, this will be, I think, passed down to the American consumer. Christine Lagarde of IMF the managing director, warned of the risks to the global economy and urged countries to work together to build a global trade system that is stronger, fairer, and fit for the future. What concerns her is the fracturing of the global value chains that could have a devastating effect in many countries, including advanced economies, and prevent the emerging and low-income countries from reaching their potential. Now, evidence is not far behind. On October 4th, 2018, the Center for Economic and Business Research in the United Kingdom reported that President Trump's trade measures have hit $2.5 billion worth of British exports this year. The tariffs on Chinese goods alone have damaged about half the Chinese exports to the United States originating from Britain. Britain is sending stuff, part of that value chain. And adding the US tariffs on European Union steel and aluminum exports, British exports have been adversely affected to the sum of $3 billion. So they too are feeling the pinch, and I think some other countries too in Europe. What is China likely to do in the trade war? I think there are three possibilities of action. I'm sure there are others, but I will list three. One, China would continue to negotiate with the United States. Two, China could stay put and sit out this period. It could turn inward to develop domestic-driven growth, which it was in any case beginning to do, consumption-led growth, before President Trump came on the scene. This could help rebalance the trade deficit. And three, China would remain open to trade with those who are willing to trade with it. And in fact, Li Keqiang recently in July said to the Europeans at a EU-China summit, China's door is opening up and will only open wider to the outside world. The Chinese government recently has taken a host of measures, including reducing tariffs and expanding market access. That's Li Keqiang, not me. This is what he's saying to Europe. So they will continue to trade. Now, there is general agreement that the trade war is not a quick fix. It will take a long time to iron out the differences. But these are not exclusive courses of action. In fact, it is likely all three actions can be activated when appropriate, at the same time. And everybody is wondering what will happen when President Trump meets President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of G20 to see whether it moves anything. Asians believe China has a right to develop and grow into a great power, but want it to abide by the rules of the international order. The issues of market access, IP rights, are real for the United States and the European Union, and China should work this out with the two trading partners. China believes the United States is trying to contain China through investment and trade and seek to change the political and economic system of China, so they are standing still and resisting. The rise of China as a great power goes beyond President Trump and will be faced by next presidents. How will the status quo power accept the new power? The answer, from my point of view, is not very well. And it is not at all clear how it should or would accommodate the new power. I mean, what should the United States do? Sometimes we say the United States doesn't know what to offer and China doesn't know what to ask and hasn't asked. So how do you accommodate? So we can expect the transition to be complicated and disruptive. The world order is changing, but messily. It will be tense and very difficult. The hegemony of the United States at the end of the Cold War morphed into predominance, and even that is weakening in Asia because the United States does not have the appetite for global leadership anymore. Ironically, the United States economy is as strong as it has been in decades, and unemployment is at an all-time low. On the matter of protecting America's interests, President Trump has taken the lead and is remaking the international economic order and the international trading system. I think, he seems to be promoting a sort of mercantilist model. New powers are rising, a multipolar world is emerging, but it is an asymmetrical multipolar world, one where the United States is still the tallest pole. The next pole is trying to catch up. The dominant pole will not yield its place without a fight and is prepared to smash the competition. Is the United States winning the battle but losing the war? For partners and friends over the last 7 decades, America has been a generous and magnanimous power. It stood for values and gave hope to the unfree and to the poor. Today, America is no longer as inclusive or generous, and its definition of interest is much narrower. Ascendant China is assertive and nationalistic and is now taking a more ideological path. The story it needs to tell is not just one of economic success. It needs soft power, a soft power story. But it is not offering compelling values or attractive ones. This multipolar order will last for a long time, though the pole positions in the region, my region, could in the longer run switch. Globally, I think it will be a multipolar world with the United States as a lead pole. Ho Kwon Ping, a well-known Asian business leader from Singapore, has predicted that we are likely to see the end of universalism and the rise of contextualism. If you go to Asia, you hear a lot of this sort of, talk. Which is a result of the rising powers of China and India, and to which should be added the reluctance of America to take the lead, and increasingly to speak with a consensus on values. So is this a paradigm shift from a bipolar world to a unipolar world to a multipolar world? Is basically a paradigm shift. And with President Trump openly rejecting many elements of the rules-based liberal international order and multilateralism, he is changing the old paradigm. But it is not clear what has emerged. How does it look from Southeast Asia? Small countries and middle-sized countries want and need a rules-based international order. This is essential for our survival. We need multilateralism, free and open trade, and an open international economic system. At the UN recently, the concern for the future of multilateralism was widespread. My foreign minister, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, in his speech to the Assembly said, multilateralism is at the crossroads. There is increasing anxiety over unilateralism, that we are going back to a world where the big impose their will, and the only option for small states is to become proxy states. Another key theme at the UNGA was free trade, with Singapore emphasizing support for the WTO as a neutral arbiter when trade disputes rise. Now, this is why countries in the Asia-Pacific are working strenuously towards the completion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which will bring 10 countries of ASEAN together with Australia, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. There was RCEP and there was TPP. TPP led by US, RCEP led by China, as people said. Now, the United States doesn't want to play, so there's RCEP, And so it's there. But ASEAN is also, and when it's completed, it will be the world's largest trading bloc. ASEAN is also moving to make links with Mercosur and the Pacific Islands, building new links to Latin America. And as my foreign minister put it, we still believe in free trade, and we are proceeding despite the apparent withdrawals of bigger countries which have more options. So as we wait for the dust to settle, to read the contours of the changing order, countries are not sitting passively on the sidelines. They want to play a role in shaping the outcome and optimistically believe they can. So the changing world order is a work in progress. Thank you.
Ambassador Chan, thank you very much for your remarks. We now have time for questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and once I've acknowledged you, a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. Also, for our online audience, you can submit your questions at chi.cnf.io. And to start, yes, the gentleman in the second row, please. And a microphone's on its way.
Okay, Ambassador, thanks so much. That was really great. Bloomberg Business Week had this article recently about this little tiny crumb-sized thing on the, you know the story about the motherboards. The implication there is that China may not be as interested in preserving this this global system as it is in more aggressive goals. So my question to you is it possible, or do people consider the possibility that China's perspective towards the middle of this century is actually more aggressive than the way it's represented in these goals that you enumerated? And is there any talk in the region about the possibility that within that period of time, the dollar would be replaced as the world's trade and reserve currency?
I think the dollar is still a very strong currency, and if you ask at this time, people don't see the dollar being replaced. And the United States is now really a very dynamic and a very strong economy at this time. It has never been stronger, it seems. So we all wonder how long will this last, you know. Now, what would China's intentions be later in another 20 years on? It is hard for us to predict, you know. And that's why many of the countries in the region want to see a multipolar presence in the region. And we urge that. And a multipolar presence means that, you know, you shape norms at the same time. And so it's not just one dominant norm. So it gives us all more room to play. So my answer to you is, frankly, we can't tell. That's quite honest. And we hope that the norms will change and it will be reshaped. But as I said, China learns, you know. So, you know, on the South China Sea, it's become quieter, although, and we are negotiating the Code of Conduct framework, but they push back fishermen still. And in the waters, which Philippine fishermen thinks is their waters, but China claims is their waters. But it's really that sort of action. But I think they don't build anymore, you know. But we don't know, you know. So that's why multipolarity is highly welcomed.
We'll go to a question from our online audience. Are you optimistic about the Trump administration's diplomatic outreach to North Korea, and what steps do you feel are necessary to ensure sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Now, my take is my take. First of all, I want to say, though I'm ambassador at large, I don't speak for my foreign ministry. You know, when the Trump-Kim talks were going to take place in Singapore, I did an interview with Sky News, and I was asked, you know, what did I think about the prospects of this talk? And I said, I belong to the group that feels more optimistic. I mean, what do you gain from being pessimistic and never wanting to talk? You must talk. If you don't talk, you can't solve. But what I think makes it interesting for me is this. I learned that President Kim, when he took over, said to his people, I promise you, you will never, you know, be hungry again. You will never starve again. You will never experience a famine again. And there has been some sort of introduction of some enterprise in Pyongyang. And if you see pictures of Pyongyang, YouTube it, you see some development taking place. But the thing that convinces me is that he's 30-some years old. He does not want to live the rest of his life, another 30, 40 years being sanctioned by the United States and the world. So that's not a future. He would also lose his position, I think, if that happens. So he would like to try another way out. Will he give up his nuclear weapons the way the United States wants? I don't think so. Why should he? He would look at what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. That's one lesson. Don't give it up, you know. And I think he must have looked at what happened to the Iran deal too. So, you know, but the question is for the United States whether it is acceptable that, you know, you have whatever you negotiate, that you have some inspection. They don't start new plants and you keep things as it is. I don't know whether the weapons degrade after a while and it's not that useful, but you have to work that part out. You see what can keep, or he will give them up once he gets confidence that this is a real thing going on. So the timetable for giving up may be different according to him, and to the United States is not fast enough. So you've got to work out something. But in that sense, he probably reads that President Trump is a good person to deal with. If there's anyone you can deal with, it is him, because he wants a deal and he's unpredictable. And Kim Jong-un is very unpredictable too.
We have time for one final question. We'll go to one more from our live stream audience. How can the U.S. and China build mutual trust with each other to reduce tensions and prevent future conflict?
Wow, that's a really tough question. You know, I would have thought that certainly allowing thousands of Chinese students coming to the United States to study was a really good move. And I hope they can continue to come to study. And it would be important for American students to go to China to study too, so that you understand each other. Steve Schwarzman created the Schwarzman Scholarships, a reverse of the Rhodes Scholarship. And I think the idea was to do exactly that. So you build from the base, and that takes a long time. And you would have to do business, and I think the business experience, American companies will say, was not too hot. And now I think the business is taking a different position towards China. So I think the act of working together has to be good for both. And I think China can help here. So you build trust from students to the day-to-day business work, which hasn't, I think the experience the America wants is different. So if you can start working with that, it can help.
Thank you. Now please join me in thanking our 2018 Marshall in Bhutan Asia Fellow, Ambassador Chan Heng Chee.
Thank you.